Take a journey with me to Maxwell Street, circa the 1940s. But first, let's uncover why move to the big city and leave everything behind.
Everything gonna be all right this morning. Ooh, yeah.
As African Americans left the South in large numbers, many worked their way to Chicago, leaving behind poverty, racial segregation, and control. Conversely, Chicago was a booming city full of opportunity, hope, and entertainment. Most of the African American Southerners coming to Chicago were from Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Louisiana. From 1940 to 1950, the African American population in Chicago rose by a whopping 77% from the previous decade. Stockyards, steel mills, foundries, and packing plants were some of the jobs available to the newcomers. Whereas a sharecropper would make just 30 to 50 cents per day, jobs available in Chicago paid this much per hour. The Illinois Central Railroad was the method of travel, and it offered a near straight line up from Mississippi north to Chicago. Without a doubt, the move was a very tough and stressful situation. However, by the 1940s, most people coming up from the South had relatives already in place in Chicago that could offer some assistance with the transition. From a musician's perspective, Chicago was a whole new world. In the late 30s and early 40s, recording artists such as Tampa Red, Big Bill Broonzy, Memphis Minnie, and others, especially John Lee Williamson, with a heavy debt to the country blues artists who preceded them, pioneered and laid the foundation for Chicago blues. The next wave of musicians coming to Chicago in the mid to late 40s could not get work in clubs immediately. Instead, they would play on the street or house parties and try to get to know the already established recording musicians by going to their shows at night. Sonny Boy Williamson, John Lee Williamson, and Big Bill Broonzy are well known for taking these newcomers under their wing and allowing them to sit in with their band. This process wasn't always a quick one, so performing on the street was a logical first choice and a great starting place it proved to be for many. Maxwell Street was a well-known open-air market that loosely began in the late 1800s and by 1912 was officially recognized by the city of Chicago. Aptly named the Maxwell Street Market, or Jewtown as many of the locals referred to it. On market days, the streets were closed to traffic. A melting pot of cultures in all walks of life, Maxwell Street was wall-to-wall people trying to find a bargain. Anything and everything could be found there, and if you were willing to haggle, you may get lucky and find a great deal. On the other hand, there were also pushy salesmen and scammers looking for easy prey to take advantage of. In addition to the storefront businesses, there were push carts and stands lined up in front of the businesses to lure people in for another sale. snake oil medicines, clothes, furniture, radios and TVs, car tires, just a few items that could be found at the market. The 1940s were a very exciting time for Chicago blues. With the influx of African Americans now living in Chicago, blues was something familiar and relatable. The addition of amplified instrumentation also mirrored the newfound energy and feeling of opportunity that the big city offered newcomers. After the Petrillo ban was lifted, small recording labels were popping up, capturing this new hybrid sound of amplified country blues. Up until this time, the record business had been dominated, if not monopolized, by the larger companies such as Bluebird and Columbia. Some of the biggest names in blues got their start in Chicago right there on Maxwell Street, and many kept performing there even after quote-unquote making it, because the money was so good. Despite it going against musician union rules, some union musicians would hide in the shadows playing an instrument other than their primary one, or find a spot off the beaten path to make extra money on the weekends performing on the streets of the open-air market. There are many interviews stating that the guys would make shoe boxes full of money, filled 4 to 5 times over, more money than they've ever seen, quote-unquote. A good group of musicians could bring in $100 to $120, when at the time you could buy a Polish sausage for a dime or a pork sandwich for 20 cents. A typical hard labor job was only paying $8 to $9 per day, whereas on the street you could make $20 to $35 apiece. The extra money earned could then be used towards new equipment. Many guys got their first amplifiers in the late 40s, typically paired with a hollow body guitar outfitted with a de-armament pickup. Musicians would pay tenants and business owners for juice, quote-unquote, to power their amplifiers. To be heard over the large crowds of Maxwell Street, amplification was a necessity. Chicago blues, as we now know it, was being forged right there on the streets. The main market, especially as it pertains to blues, was on Maxwell Street between Sangamon and Union Avenue. And before the mid-50s, when the Dan Ryan Expressway was completed, the market continued past Union Avenue to the east in the 600 and lower blocks. The market was also unofficially extended north and south of Maxwell Street for at least several blocks, where musicians would also set up, especially later on in the 50s and 60s and after. Located near the center of the market, just off the intersection of Maxwell Street and Newberry at 831 West Maxwell Street, was the legendary Maxwell Radio / Ora Nelle Records, which was the only record company on Maxwell Street. The owners were Bernard Abrams and his wife Idelle, who went by Red. They opened their doors in approximately 1946, and for the first year or so, the business was still basically a house, with the owners living in the back. Having 2 adjacent storefronts, one functioning as a record shop and next door an electronics repair shop. Local musicians would hang out around the store, sometimes getting electricity from Abrams to power their amplifiers to perform outside the store. At some point, Abrams invested in a portable disc cutter and began recording local Maxwell Street musicians. Bernard would pay the musician an upfront flat fee, and if he thought he had something special, he had a batch of records pressed to sell in a store. Incredibly, Little Walter's first recordings were made here. Other artists include Otham Brown, Jimmy Rogers, Johnny Williams, Johnny Young, Johnny Temple, and Bo Weevil. Muddy Waters would sometimes do appearances in 831 to promote his own records or the Ora Nelle releases. Initially, only 2 official releases were made, and later in 1969, George Paulus bought and released all 14 sides, taken directly from the original lacquers made by Abrams. All of the existing recordings were recorded in 1947, although the original 78s were still available over 20 years later for $1 each, up through the mid-70s. My discovery in finding photos of 831 started with this incredible photo by Charles Cushman, taken directly across from 831 at 830 Maxwell Street in 1950. As I later learned in a Facebook message exchange with Bernard Abrams' daughter, Fern Abrams Packer, who was born in 1949 and spent time in the store as a young girl, states, quote, "There was a record store across the street at 830 Maxwell Street. So Bernard bought the building across the street from it, established Maxwell Street Radio, then after making some money, bought the 830 building and did not renew the lease, thus knocking out his competition." She also states that her brother was born in 1946, and she's sure that Bernard took over the property sometime after this date. Fern was born in 1949, and her birth certificate still shows 831 as her parents' home address. At the time, Bernard had sold his property on Springfield and moved into the back apartment on the first floor, in the back of the store where her mother was pregnant with her. She also had a sister who was born in 1948, which Fern believes is the approximate time when most of the work was done to the store. Fern's sister remembers Bernard telling the girls to be quiet and to clean the threads off the record as it was being cut. She remembers musicians being there as well. It sounds like they only lived in the back of the store for a year or so. There was also an upstairs portion, which is visible in the 1940s photos and later covered up with large wood coverings with the store name painted on it and 831 Bargain Center of the World painted on top of the wood. However, according to Fern, the upstairs portion was always in the process of renovation and just used for storage. Bernard was in World War II and got out around 1942 or 1943, worked at Galvin Electronics Manufacturing, now known as Motorola. He worked for them for a short time, then bought the store. As I began hunting for more pictures of 831, I discovered that next door to the east was the Maxwell Maternity Center. I found several examples of this business that also showed just a sliver of 831 to the right, when 831 was just a house. Here are the original press photos that I acquired, along with the information that is provided on the backs. One for 1939, another from 1944, and lastly, 1948, which I found incredibly interesting. The time frame was just right, especially the one from 1948. Interesting and so close, which only fueled my need to find more. I then found these incredible photos by Jim O'Neill of Living Blues, taken in, I believe, 1975. Several high-quality photos showing the outside of the store, Bernard Abrams himself, who I'd previously not seen, the inside of the store, merchandise for sale in the windows. I felt like I'd hit the lottery with this series of photos. But again, I wondered what 831 looked like in its peak years. To my absolute surprise, around 2015 or so, and again a few months later, I finally struck gold, pure gold. 2 full-color Kodachrome slides showing 831, the legendary Ora Nelle records in Maxwell Radio shown in 1953, incredibly vivid and perfectly demonstrating a typical Sunday market day. The brick red and white neon sign hanging over the entrance is vibrant, with an earlier version of the wood paneling that covered the house. I finally felt like the puzzle was complete. To this day, these are the only 2 photos or slides that I've seen or have been able to locate. I believe I've seen some video footage that shows the sign in full color as well, but the footage was from much later. Also, according to Fern, there was an opening between 831 and the business next door that he also owned. The recording equipment was set up a couple feet from the opening between the two stores. It's unclear what era she's referring to. I'm assuming later in the 50s and 60s, as all the stories I've read indicate that at the time the Ora Nelle signs were cut in the front of the store, and that Bernard was using a green Recordio/Wilcox Gay direct-to-acetate recorder, and musicians would sit on boxes while recording. The machine was also described as looking almost army-issued. Fern thinks the equipment was moved when she was 5 to 6 years old, and she was born in 1949, which would be approximately 54 or 55. Here are the closest examples I've been able to find based on the descriptions of Bernie's disc cutter. According to Fern, Bernard owned 831, the building next door, and eventually almost the entire street on both sides between Peoria and Newberry. He also owned stores on Maxwell Street towards Halstead. Once I knew what 831 looked like, I knew what to look for and started noticing different block views on 831 in various DVD form and later taken stills. Here are some other notable photos that I came across later. Some other pictures of Bernie. Check out these examples of 830 Maxwell across the street, which was called Steinway's, showing the radio/record sign hanging above the entrance. Here's a photo of the corner of Maxwell and Newberry on the opposing side as Maternity Center in Ora Nelle. This would be the northwest corner. Steinway's would be just to the left of this. Here are a few block examples looking at the same side as 831. Notice the grid pattern on the building leading up to the sports sign, which was Henry's Sports early on. It may have changed names later or just gotten new signs. All seem to have sports or sporting on the sign above the door. This was next door to 831, 833 Maxwell Radio to the west, presumably 835 Maxwell Street. Here are more block views with glimpses of the 831 neon sign and or wood paneling above the store front to disguise the look of the structure being a house. Notice Chicken Man and Blind Arvella, both Maxwell Street regulars. Some of these photos you already see neighboring buildings have been demoed. A few more photos of the maternity center, one showing a sliver of 831, the third iteration of wood paneling upstairs. Here are a couple photos that were removed from the inside of 831 in the 70s, perhaps the same glossies that Jerry Portnoy recalls seeing hanging on the walls as a kid. Here's a label decal advertisement from 831. Hey, free delivery. Fern recalls the store being broken into several times and says that was the reason for the yellow window coverings added later on. Here's a quick legend that I created that shows the different iterations of how 831 looked over the years, from the mid-40s when Abrams bought the property all the way up to the final days in the 70s. I guess the store made it a bit longer, even up until the 80s, but moved down the street to, I believe, 805 Maxwell Street, presumably one of the other buildings he owned. By this time, I've heard from a few others that the original 78s were bought up and no longer available. At this time, I'd like to present Jerry Portnoy, legendary harmonica player for the Muddy Waters Band, and whose father owned a store on Maxwell Street, and he gives a first-hand account of growing up near Maxwell Street and walking these streets at the times we're talking about here.
Hi, I'm Jerry Portnoy. I grew up around Maxwell Street in the late 40s and early 50s. My father had a rug store down there. And back then, Maxwell Street was a place unlike any other place in the country. It was an old world open air bazaar where everything and anything was for sale. Of course, you haggled for everything. There were no fixed prices. The merchants who had standing stores on the street often had pullers out front, and they were called pullers because they literally would pull passing foot traffic into the store to try and sell you something. The whole area was just a riot of colors and sounds and sights and smells, and every kind of humanity was down there. Sunday was the big day where people from all over the Midwest would stream into town. And of course, blues was played all around the area, along with other kinds of music and various pitchmen, and there were gospel singers and people trying to sell you diamonds and watches and all kinds of things down there. It was quite a place. And right down the street from my father's store on the other side of Halstead Street was Maxwell Radio and Records at 831 Maxwell Street. And I was in there as a kid, and what I remember about it mostly was the walls were covered with glossies of musicians, and they had bins which were full of old tubes and radio knobs. And of course, that's where little Walter cut his first record, Just Keep Lovin' Her. And many years later, when I was already grown, around 1970, I went down there, and actually Bernie Abrams, who ran the record store and Ora Nelle Records, which was the label that Walter's record came out on, he was still working there behind the counter, and I bought a couple of copies of Just Keep Lovin' Her, which were still in the original brown paper sleeves. Unfortunately, the whole Maxwell Street area was kind of bulldozed into history when the University of Illinois bought up all the land, and they pretty much knocked everything down. And to me, it was an act of cultural murder. There was no place like it, and I still miss it. And that's what I got to say about that. So check it out. Check out Mark Mumea's wonderful website, and he's keeping the flame alive for early Chicago blues. All right, this is Jerry Portnoy signing off.
Check out the absolute massacre of Maxwell Street from the late 30s to the early 80s. It's absolutely unbelievable to me that none of these key landmarks could have been spared despite heavy protests. Here's a Ray Fleur Lodge photo, I believe showing a dirt lot that Bernie had created a sign for. Here's a photo that I found somewhere online that claims to be 831 in ruins. I believe I read somewhere that a fire occurred here at some point. I'm guessing this picture is from the 80s. It does seem to be the correct location. Before getting into the closing remarks, here's a few minutes of quotes from interviews taken from various sources from the musicians who lived and breathed Maxwell Street in the 40s. For anyone interested, I have a music website entitled Devil's Tail Music. I have a custom Maxwell Street poster available featuring one of the Kodachrome images I unearthed. There are also t-shirts, decals, free guitar lesson videos, and more. Any support would be greatly appreciated and helps in making videos like this one. If you enjoyed the content in this video, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Although some big-name players such as Muddy Waters and Jimmy Rogers have stated in an interview that they did not play on the street, that it was way beneath them, they chose instead to lean on their success in the clubs and on recordings. It seems that, in my opinion, after reading the interviews from so many well-known Maxwell Street performers, the evidence points to these guys at least performing on the streets in the early days in Chicago. While others, such as Junior Wells and I presume Little Walter, in addition to so many others, are very clear in stating that they got their start on Maxwell Street and they made very good money. If nothing else, Maxwell Street served as a means to help support themselves, to develop their sound, and in some cases led to recording deals and very successful music careers. In addition, despite the fact that many of the 30s and 40s recording artists were never interviewed on the subject matter, after hearing Henry Townsend's account and Hammy Nixon's account, I get the impression that many of these early musicians performed on the street as well. It also sounds like at the time there may have been less of a stigma associated with performing on the street. Tragically, the Maxwell marketplace is long gone. A slow process of urban renewal, which appears to have started as far back as the 40s and 50s, gained further and further traction with every passing decade, finally gave way in 1994 when the final structures were demolished, making way for UIC, University of Chicago, athletic facilities, and parking structures. But the music the Maxwell Street musicians left us and the material that was recorded at 831 will live forever.